Welcome to The Aperture, a podcast for curious minds and critical social thinkers, hosted by me, Steph Cutler. If you believe a better world is worth consideration, then you're in good company. Each episode, I chat with someone with views and/or experiences of a social issue, and at the end, I hand over to a creative contributor who has the final say. In today's episode of The Aperture, I'm talking all things allyship with Leyla Okhai. I first met Leyla when she was head of the Centre for Diversity, Equality and Inclusion at Imperial College London. She brought me in to support with their disability inclusion agenda, and we've stayed in touch and remained friends ever since. Prior to joining Imperial College, Leyla worked at the University of Oxford, firstly in student recruitment, specialising in increasing the representation of applications from students from a global majority background. She then went on to pioneer innovative race and religious belief equality initiatives at Oxford's Diversity and Equality Unit. Leyla has since gone on to set up her company, Diverse Minds UK, where she works with organisations to create happy, equal and mentally healthy workplaces through speaking, training, coaching and consultancy. Our poet today is Annie Rockson. Annie's talent for poetry was first recognised at the age of 10 when Cherie Blair visited her primary school. Recognition of her talent continued, and so Annie began performing her poetry and has done so at venues such as the Mayor of London's office, the House of Commons and the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park, and at festivals such as Lovebox and the first ever Winchester Poetry Festival. She also had a poem featured on the first ever Instagram poetry exhibition. Annie's creative response will follow the conversation I had with Leyla Okhai. I wanted to start by asking you, because I know you've worked in the race equality space for 15 years plus, about your thoughts and feelings about where we're at currently, and in particular the Black Lives Matter movement.
And what I do keep saying is that, Black Lives Matter is actually 600 years old, really, as in, if we think about the systemic injustices, if we think about colonialism, if we think about the way that Black bodies have been treated, it's not new. But this particular wave, it's horrific what happened, but I'm pleased that it's gotten more people to sit up, and we're able to have conversations that we couldn't have before. And I was looking at a presentation that I did last year for a reciprocal mentoring program for an institution. So it's Black staff and staff of colour in an institution that were reciprocally mentoring senior white staff. And the content of that presentation last year was about culture. We couldn't necessarily talk about race in the same way they could now. And now what's great is I've had the license to kind of rip up the traditional rule book, if you like, and we are talking about white fragility. We're talking about white privilege with senior white staff. We are talking about colonialism. We are talking about white saviour complex, things that I just think people would have walked out of the room before. And now, I'm not saying it's perfect at all, and I feel that you can start to have these conversations, and there is still defensiveness in some cases, but at least I can put these slides up and we can have conversations about them. So I think in terms of allyship and kind of where people are aiming to go, what might have been their blind spots, I feel that there has been a slight change in the fact that people are willing to think about, well, where are my blind spots? How do I illuminate them? I need to start thinking about these things. And actually, this is really flipping uncomfortable, and I have to sit with that and do my own work.
And that we even have blind spots,
Yeah.
And I think you're right to acknowledge that Black Lives Matter is not a new phenomenon, and yet it kind of can feel a bit like that because of the prominence right now. It feels like there's a shift taking place, and whether that leads to fundamental social change is not the same as a shift. Black people in my network saying we can finally start to have the conversations that need to be had. This is actually quite cathartic for me. This feels different to it has before in terms of the openness to at least recognize, power and privilege and those kind of conversations, which aren't easy to have, are they?
No, and I think it's fascinating for me that I sometimes I struggle to wrap my head around the fact that it's so difficult for people, because those of us who identify as being from communities of colour or global majority, Black global majority groups, we have to think about this and have conversations about this most days.
Mm-hmm.
I also am very aware that I'm not Black. I consider myself part of the Black with a capital B political movement, but I know that I'm not Black in terms of how other Black communities would identify my skin colour. So also the other thing I wanted to mention is within British South Asian communities, we've also got a hell of a long way to go on this.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, we've got the structures that have been created by whiteness and that do privilege white communities. But I think often my experience of British South Asian communities is that they can pander to that. They don't want to challenge it. And there are certain horrific perceptions around Blackness, around colorism, around shadism that we need to start having conversations about. And I know that, I've had conversations in my South Asian female membership group and people are receptive to that. But what I think a lot of the group have struggled with is how do we have those conversations with our families? Also, how do we have those conversations when a lot of the wider British South Asian community are bi and trilingual, and the language we use and how that translates across. So this is a really big thing, and we all have to be thinking about it, and we all have to be thinking about our own cultural contexts and how we have those conversations and what we might have to adapt within our own cultural frameworks in order to make headway. And this isn't a one and done. This is a kind of rinse and repeat, keep going, keep coming from different angles, thinking about it, being an exemplar. And actually it is exhausting, but it's really exhausting for those of us who have to live with systemic injustices day on day. And of course that will be a sliding scale.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's everybody's responsibility.
Yes, and that's the thing with institutions and organisations as well, Steph, that, this kind of work, as we know, it's kind of, oh, right, the equality and diversity team are dealing with it, or someone in HR has been given the remit. To me, it's not just an HR issue at all. To me, this has got to come from the CEO, the COO, the CFO, the leaders. And actually, I feel that we're not seeing that in our government at the moment. And there's a lot of floundering that does permeate down. Whereas if we've got a microcosm or an organisation that are really clear, even if they put their hand up and say, we have no idea what to do, but we know that we need to do something, and we're going to talk to people externally, we're going to look at our existing policies and procedures, we're going to use our staff networks or develop genuine staff networks, I think that's great. But I think admitting that you don't know everything is actually part of the journey as well.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's quite welcome. Because it isn't easy, and I appreciate when your lived experience means it's not easy daily, but actually it isn't easy for everybody, because you can be quite uncomfortable with not knowing, and I think part of what seems to be happening lately is it's becoming a bit more acceptable to say I don't know. You don't get the opportunity to create the change or for the right people to be sat around the right tables and so on. So that seems to be a bit better lately.
I think you're right, and I think people are willing to admit they're on a journey. I think people are willing to admit they need ally training, whether that's on race, whether that's on, about LGBTQIA plus communities, whether that's about disability. I think we've still got a long way to go with disability, actually. Whether that's about, thinking about the systems that benefit men as a result of patriarchy. Although, having said that, there was a group, wasn't there, of Tory MPs that refused to have unconscious bias training. Now, I don't think unconscious bias training is the same as allyship by a long stretch, but the form of words they used was that we don't want to be indoctrinated into this woke way of thinking. So we know we've still got a long way to go, and again, I think unconscious bias training is part of the journey, but I don't think it can totally get people to understand all the systemic injustices and structures that exist. And I think a lot of that needs to be based on understanding of history and the development of whose stories get told, whose stories get remembered and recorded as well.
This idea of allyship seems to have got some traction sort of over the last 5+ years. We had He for She came out from the 2014 from the United Nations with a global effort to include men and boys in creating gender equality. We have purple allies in the disability space, straight allies in the LGBTQ space, and white allies. It feels as though there's more attention being given to that of late. What role can allyship play in creating sustainable, meaningful change?
I really like that question. And I think there's that difference, isn't there, between being an ally and being a saviour.
Yes.
So, and again, people say, well, how do I know I'm an ally and how do I know I'm a saviour? And when I did a lot of work in the more work in the disability space, I was always conscious of that, because what you don't want to do is go up to someone and say, do you need assistance? How can I help you? Oh my God, you can't carry that cup of tea, or whatever it is. So I think part of allyship is that you're going to be on a constant journey and recalibrating, a bit like you do with like recipes and salt, right? So sometimes you might make something, you put too much salt in it, you make it again, you might put too little. I mean, it's still edible, but you're thinking, what's the right level? And I think allyship is that. I think one of the things with allyship is that you're never going to know it all, and you can't know everything about everything, because it's just not possible. But it's educating yourself so you have a good base, and then learning as you meet different people and how people's lived experiences give rise to preferences, and how we need to adapt and adjust accordingly to those preferences. So I guess one example is if you've worked with someone with dyslexia, and one of their preferences is that they use cream paper and they use a live scribe pen, they have an overlay on their computer. Brilliant. Now, you might then work with someone else who has dyslexia, and actually they don't want an overlay on their computer, and their dyslexia manifests itself in a different way, and maybe they don't want to use their live scribe pen in the same way that the other person did. It's about saying, okay, that's cool, I hear your preferences, as opposed to, oh, but I know all about dyslexia, and actually what you need is this. You're coming at it from the right angle, but actually you're not empowering the person. And that's the thing, isn't it? It's that thing around, we have to think about plurality, we have to think about where we're coming from, and we have experience of working with people from a particular background, from a particular preference, but that won't be everyone who identifies with the same group or disability or identity. They will not necessarily want to be treated that way or have the same preferences, because they're also individuals. I think that's one part of it, and the learning journey.
You're not going to get it right for everybody all the time, and probably you can't. It might be impossible to get it right all the time, because like you've mentioned, people have different preferences as well as requirements. And so, getting it right, what would likely help is as an ally is to come alongside and listen, and then ask the question, how might I support you? And be more reactive, having listened, as opposed to jumping in. I think sometimes well-meaning people jump in, and that then isn't so helpful, and in fact can have the adverse effect.
And I think that when you ask questions, make sure the questions are for the benefit of the individual, and not because you feel nosy or because you feel you've got the right to know, because that can emphasize and re-emphasize power imbalances. So an example would be, you might have been on some allyship training, you might be tempted to ask someone about, let's say they've got a sensory impairment, maybe you think, you're trying to be supportive, oh, what kind of hearing aid do you have? And, oh, when did you get your hearing aid? Okay, so in some circumstances that might be helpful, but actually what you really want to know is, if I switch on the T loops, let's test it, does it work for you? As opposed to delving into the nuts and bolts. We don't need to ask those private questions. What we need to know is the environment accessible for you? Are the systems accessible for you? And it goes for race as well. Do we really need to know where someone's quote unquote really from? We just need to know, do you feel able to feel heard at meetings? Do you feel you've got a space that's appropriate for you? Do you have any specific cultural requirements, or are there things that you need that we could do better? And I think, to me, that's the difference. And thinking about, again, if we think about parenthood, and what people need in terms of their caring responsibilities, we don't need to know the ins and outs of their caring responsibilities. We just need to know about, do they need flexible working? What does the flexible work pattern look like to them? If the person they're caring for, whether it's a younger dependent or an older dependent, need to go to hospital, or there's an emergency, what's the plan? Who could take over that work? What work could be paused? And a lot of this is common sense, but sadly it's not always common practice.
Yeah, I often urge people to curb their curiosity.
Yeah, that's it, isn't it? Yes, lovely phrase, curb your curiosity.
Because when you're on the wrong side of that regularly, apart from anything, it just becomes annoying, doesn't it? But it does highlight your difference.
Yeah, and by all means ask questions, but remember that your question should always be guided by, how is it benefiting the individual?
So when does genuine allyship work well? Have you any experiences of that, Leyla?
So interestingly, we had a conversation about this yesterday in one of the training sessions, and we were talking about so in the world of sports and taking a knee, and whether that's American in the US context, the UK context, or other contexts. And the question that was asked to me was actually, is it okay if white UK footballers take the knee with their black colleagues? And I said, well, actually, if there's been a discussion in the dressing room or the boardroom or in the players' football, the PFA, and black colleagues have said, actually, yes, that would be really helpful and we feel supported, then absolutely do it. And I think it also sends a message that Black Lives Matter, and by us as white individuals or individuals who don't define as black are with our black colleagues doing this. But I think it has to be done with consultation with the individuals and not just assume, oh, this is what they want. So I think to me that's a really helpful way of doing it, just thinking about sports and the pushback around, oh, sports isn't political. Well, absolutely it is, because who owns football clubs? Where does the money come from? That's political. When things go belly up in football clubs, how do they get saved? It is all political, and I would say that it is also about raising awareness around human life is so important. By taking a knee in a really respectful, peaceful way, to me that does demonstrate things, and maybe it starts to get people thinking around, no, this is about everyone, but we all need to think about how and respond to Black Lives Matter. So that's one example. I mean, that's quite a public example. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of an organizational example, it's about being really mindful and cognizant around the needs of others. And like you said, you won't always get it right, but let's say there's a new system that's coming into place, a new computer system. And we're thinking about, okay, how's it going to work? And so I think some of the questions that always need to be asked, and it doesn't have to be anyone who's got a sensory impairment or physical impairment, but actually those questions around, okay, so how does this work with assistive software technology? So if people are using Claro Read, if they're using JAWS, if they're using Zoom, any assistive technology, actually before we roll this out, we need to test it, and we need to go back to the developers and ask these questions. And that can just be standard on a checklist, right? So it doesn't have to be something added on, but to me that is allyship, because it's not a bolt-on, you're making it part of the day-to-day. Or if we're thinking about
make it part of a regular brief.
Exactly.
Then it's part of what you do, and then test it and then come back.
So exactly. So that to me is a form of allyship, isn't it? Because you're not then expecting the people who use assistive technology to always have to remind people and to always have to be the one to say things.
I've got an example of that actually this year, Leyla. I was constantly having to self-advocate in order to get information so as I could participate. And I found myself in a meeting whereby I was having to say it once again. And two of my colleagues just spoke up and said, this is not good enough. We're not getting this right often enough, which is a general organisational point, but actually really had my back and said, if this is what Steph needs, not wants, needs, then we need to make sure that this is what Steph has. And I really felt so supported and so appreciative of two people speaking up, because they didn't have to, because it doesn't affect them, but they were mindful enough to. And what it did was it made me feel less alone, because when you're the only person having to keep pushing and pushing for the change that you need and that you want to see, and actually it's important to me because it is for me, but it's also for the people who come after me. So I feel a responsibility and obligation to keeping on.
And it takes away that mental load, doesn't it, Steph? So that that mental load about, oh well, you're responsible because you're the person who uses XYZ, or you're the person who feels a certain way, and then it's like you have to organize it. It's like your thing. And I think when people do it in a genuine way, like you gave that beautiful example, it just takes that mental load and that stress off and just alleviates the brain space. I
felt immediately better and less stressed. It meant that I could participate better. Sometimes you just have to call it out. I think the line can be blurred when people end up speaking on your behalf or for you. I think there's a line to tread about coming alongside and speaking in support of. And when you get that right, I don't think you can go too wrong then, actually.
Agree. And I guess it crosses over to the point we were discussing earlier about when are you an ally and when are you a saviour. So it's that speaking over, isn't it? It's that speaking over, speaking for. But again, if you're in a meeting where that individual or that group of people are not present and you've consulted with them, and then you say, well, actually, I've done a bit of research and consulted, and this is what this group of people or this person needs, then again, that's different, because you've done your homework in a way, and you're speaking with authority because you've consulted them and they don't have a space at that table. And part of that allyship could be, I'm speaking on behalf of, this group of people or this individual, but actually I think we really need to have them in this room and at this table.
Question why they're not there.
Yeah, exactly.
Because you can't really talk about allyship without talking about power and privilege.
Definitely. And I think it's that thing, and who gets power and who gets privilege and why. And if we look at the top team of, I would say, 99% of medium to large organizations, will see that the representation is not often there, is it? It's very, very lacking. The system is still very Victoriana in the UK. It's designed, I think, for white heterosexual men of a particular height, in fact, who go home to their, traditionally, in Victorian times, they would go home to a wife who'd been looking after the children. And if they were middle class or upper middle class or upper class, they would have also had home help. And that just, that system isn't really working anymore. So why on earth do we have it? But anyway, that's another podcast episode, I think.
It isn't always apparent to white people the power and privilege that they have. I think sometimes that can feel a bit like words that some white people can't really associate with if they don't understand fully the systems that they live and work within, because they don't always feel very privileged and they don't always feel very powerful, but it's all relative.
Yes, and that was something else I was talking about yesterday. So there've been some examples, actually, Steph, in Bristol, where there have been white families who have been incredibly disadvantaged, so socioeconomic disadvantage, where they're living off 2 cans of baked beans in a day, and it's horrific, and absolutely something has to be done about that. And so when communities who are socially disadvantaged, whether it's inner city or rural areas, and they feel very marginalized, and they hear the term white privilege, of course, it's understandable why people are going to balk at that. Because that's really going to rile them, and I understand that. And then maybe they turn on the TV and they see very accomplished, very famous black musicians, black actors, black business people, whatever it is, and think, how dare someone say that I've got white privilege, look at these rich people. And so I think this country does have a problem, actually, with pitting white British people from low socioeconomic backgrounds against each other. I think it, personally, I do think it has been a political strategy, and you see it in the media all the time. I think the thing to think about is that, of course, people from white backgrounds who identify as white can experience horrific circumstances, but that usually, more cases than not, their skin color doesn't add to that. So what do I mean by that? They're much less likely to be stopped and searched. They're much more likely to have the freedom, if they have the funds to travel, to not be stopped and searched and be suspected of terrorism. Now, I know that's shifted because, of course, Northern Ireland with Irish communities, they faced stop and search in the 70s, 60s, 50s, etc. Also, they're much more likely to get a job. So again, I know that people struggle to get jobs, especially now, but if you look at the stats, you're 4 times more likely to get a job with a white sounding name than you are with an African or Asian sounding name. Now, of course, if you're in the depths of despair and there's no support for you, these things don't matter, because your lived experience is going to scream all of these things. So I think the key thing, again, if we think about allyship, is how do we as a society as a whole support people who are in these horrific situations by lobbying our government, by thinking about the welfare systems, and by having sustainable jobs and not 0-hour contracts. So there's allyship on a micro, macro, organizational, societal level. But actually, we also need to realize, and this is what right-wing groups, how they prey on people's vulnerabilities, is of course this, and it creates a more divided society. So if we can all start talking about privilege, because we all have certain advantages. I often say, privilege is a bit like currency, that just because I have brown skin doesn't mean I'm not privileged in every single area. I grew up with a lot of privilege, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So often you hear about this immigrant story. Oh, and for some people, the children or the second or third generation have more privilege than their parents. In my case, it's not the case. My parents had a lot more privilege than I do. So, I think we all need to start thinking about the privileges we have. It could be our skin color, it could be our socioeconomic status, it could be where we live, it could be the school we went to. But also that there are certain things that are woven into the fabric of our structure, which mean that white communities will still have an advantage, even though in the moment they have extreme social disadvantage, but also how we need to help and support people in an appropriate way and challenge the systems that tie people down.
Leyla, thank you for that. I just wanted to end on, what might you suggest for people listening thinking, yeah, I get this more, I wonder what I could be doing. But I just wonder if there's a few kind of principles that would be worth sharing.
So I think the first one is around how do you educate yourself? So thinking about, what is my thought process about the systems? What are these systems? So I would say, educate yourself about patriarchy, educate yourself about the ableist viewpoint. So in effect, learning about the social model of disability, educate yourself about systemic racism, educate yourself about heteronormative values, and also, read around age discrimination or age perceptions. And some of us might have, I think usually there's a better understanding of that because our age changes as we grow up, and we might notice different things about that. Now, this doesn't have to be, oh my goodness, I have to read university sociology textbooks, although if you want to do that, go for it. But I think the positive thing is there's so much on Instagram. They're good people on Instagram. They're good people to follow on Facebook. They're good people that we can follow on Twitter and not be sucked into the negativity.
There's not an excuse to not know anymore, because
mm-hmm.
there's so much information available to us. It's up to us to choose what we listen to, what we choose to read, who we choose to spend time with. So in a sense, that isn't such a difficult suggestion to fulfill, is it?
And then I think the second thing, Steph, is to ask yourself some tough questions. So a book, Layla Saad, not me, another Layla, she's written a book, White Supremacy and Me, and it's actually a workbook. And that's an example of one tool, why I'm no longer talking to white people about race. Yeah, all of these things. But, ask yourself questions, and they might be really, really tough questions. You might want to just reflect on them yourself. You might want to talk about them with your friends and your family members or your colleagues. Listen to speakers. Again, I know we're sort of in a weird quasi lockdown, but there's lots online now. So, and I know that's exhausting too in a way. But pace yourself, and also, there's asking questions to people that you want to support, but don't make them responsible for your education. So, ask yourself those questions after you read or go to events. And then the third thing is to think about small steps that you can take. So, examples could be diversity in recruitment's always a hot topic, but lots of places aren't really recruiting right now. So you could think about retention. How to retain the talent we have? When we start to recruit, what could we do to make sure that we're putting our job adverts in places that we don't usually, so it's not the same old, same old? Who are the headhunters that we use for recruiting jobs? And actually, how do we know the headhunters or the people that we appoint from recruitment agencies are trained properly? Because 9 times out of 10, they're not. They don't do this work. They just want the money on the table. And I hate to be crude about it, but they don't do enough work in this area. So what are the questions that we can ask them? Do we think a staff network is an appropriate way forward for us? If so, how do we do this in a genuine way and don't just go, oh, they're a wheelchair user, they're black, they're 75. Let's get an age group, a race group, and a disability group. Maybe those people don't have any interest. But what are the ways in which we could ask quick questions to ascertain how people experience the culture, and then build an action plan as to how we're going to improve things? And I also think it's about that tweaking refinement. Why not look at what other organizations are doing and what's worked? Join organizations like Purple Space. Consultants can absolutely help. I'm not saying they're the whole entire answer. And really hold people accountable. I think one of the ways that people can be held accountable in a positive way is if you have appraisal systems, or sometimes they're called constructive conversations, whatever your mechanism is to ascertain performance. Why isn't there a question in there about, firstly, how are you, but how are you? And having that conversation about mental health and well-being. But secondly, what are the things that you're doing to contribute to our, being an ally, whether it's with a small a or a big A? because I think it's also about taking that blame away, Steph, and making it a learning curve. Now, clearly, if someone does something super offensive, we've got policies and procedures for that. But maybe someone used the term BAME, and another member of staff said, actually, can you not use that? And I'd prefer you to use the term global majority. You say, thank you so much for telling me. I'm really sorry. I won't do it again. And maybe that's part of your conversation, that actually we shouldn't be using the term BAME anymore. We need to work towards using global majority. This is the feedback I have. So from now on, this is what I'm going to do as part of your journey. And that's a small example, but we know that language makes a huge difference.
Huge thanks to Leyla there, a really insightful conversation, loads to go away and think about. Leyla mentioned recruitment, so how you recruit, where you recruit, and who you choose to recruit on your behalf. I wanted to jump in here with just a quick recommendation, because I sit on the board of Prospectus as a non-exec director, and I'm constantly impressed with their values-led approach to recruitment. It's really refreshing, and they take seriously all this stuff we've been talking about within this podcast. So if you work in the beyond profit sector and are interested in finding out more, I'm going to leave a link in the show notes. And now over to Annie Rockson. Annie wants to change perceptions through her poetry. She says she knows what it feels like not to have a voice, and she hopes that her audiences will be encouraged to speak out and create more positive communities. This makes Annie our perfect poet to join us on our episode on allyship.
What language do you speak in? Is it one of privilege, or is it one of power? Do your words break down or reconstruct the power? Can we dismantle the system with a binary language that imprisons? Do we speak to truly listen or to reaffirm our own vision? What language do you see in? Is it one of insight or getting things right? In a system where being wrong is weaponized, are our attempts to conversate ammunition to prove that we belong? In a society that tells us we are powerless and not that strong? Are our endless debates authentic attempts to emancipate? Or battles with ourselves because our identity is at stake, and when you use their tools to try and educate? Do you rebirth love? Or do you end up rebirthing hate? What language do you educate in? Is it one of freedom or one of oppression? Do you teach to overpower or break free of suppression? Do you point the finger at other worlds? Do you choose to unlearn for yourself? With constant exposure and no closure, do you unwillingly contribute to an unhappy world? Can we accept another if we don't accept ourselves? Are we searching for answers or actually screaming out for help? What language do we build in? Is truth our foundation? Do we lean into blame or recreation? Can multiple truths be held all in one space? Our bodies are infernos of both love and hate, and our actions can reveal to us what our minds really want to say. We can break into new paradigms if we are willing to confront our own pain. I see our hands clasping for dreams of better days. We will never exhaust our options. There will always be another way, but not one built in a system where our minds are meant to be enslaved. What language do you speak in? Is it one of privilege, or is it one of power? Or is it a language that we create? One that is truly ours.
That's it from me, Steph Cutler. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe so you don't miss a future episode of The Aperture on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts from. Please like, share, leave a review, and The Aperture can be found on Facebook and Twitter. This episode of The Aperture was produced by VI Podcasting. See you next time for more social change thinking.